I'm Barry Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barry.
Welcome to Back Barries from Guardian Australia. As we try and figure out whether the One Nation surge is real, we seem to be flooded with more polling than ever before, and to be frank, it's all over the shop. I want to ask you, Tony, a little later on, whether there are more pollsters or just more polling, and what makes a reliable poll. But before then, so much attention this week on the plight of the Australian families that are languishing, seemingly without much hope, in a Syrian detention camp. 3 points of view seem to be emerging. One is they're Australian, they're not being charged with anything, so let them go home and start a new life. Then there's the government position. They made their bed, they can lie in it. We know their rights, but they won't get any help from us in exercising those rights. And then you get the coalition's position. They can stay where they are, and if we could, we would legislate to make it illegal for anybody trying to help them get home. That is polarisation on steroids. Tony, we'll do the politics first because that seems to be driving everything before we look at whether there is a way through on all of this. But is this a vote changer? Is it worth the coalition trying to put it at the top of the agenda and sticking with it?
I think there are net votes on the table on this issue. We have seen in research this week that it's definitely cutting through. People are definitely absorbing the broader message and the issue generally. And that's the first hurdle to anything being salient and therefore being a vote consideration. So now how many votes are in it, remains to be seen. It's under that broad immigration umbrella, which we're seeing rise in salience. And I'll come to a few things later on about that in recent polling. But confusing the issue for Labor is that they don't have a coherent message. We've heard from 3 Labor leaders this week, Jacinta Allan, Chris Minns and Anthony Albanese, and we've heard 3 different messages. Chris Minns, I thought, was the most forthright, the clearest in his communications, and I think this sort of shows why he's, such a political athlete in the New South Wales contest. Jacinta Allan didn't want a bar of it. She ran away from it, and Albanese is still doing this kind of crab walking sort of motion of sort of saying, there's rights and passports and so forth, but, they've made their bed in it. But I think Albanese does have a habit of leaving his options open until the last possible minute, and then he either decides to go for the gap or he shuts it all down. So there's a lot to play out on this, and I think, we're going to see it increase in salience the longer it sort of drags on, I think, for want of a better word. And, because if they are brought home, that's going to be a long process, and then the resettlement here, it's all going to be a big news story, I think, and there's going to be lots of voices out there talking about it.
So to this point, what can you paraphrase sort of the view that's coming through? Is there a degree of sympathy there for these people, or are they saying, well, as Anthony Albanese said, they brought it on themselves?
Yeah, I think that message that Angus Taylor said recently, which was under Labor, immigration is too high and the standards are too low, is really landing out in the electorate. And not only do I believe that was authored by Tony Abbott, but when I hear it, I actually hear his voice narrating it. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on Barry, but that's a very Abbott play, an absolutist version of the issue. I think not helping is the cause of the ISIS families is that 7:30 report this week ran a story about ISIS sympathisers in Sydney showing video footage of bashing up people that they lured, LGBTI community members who they lured.
Yeah, absolutely, and the two shouldn't be confused. But
but it's not a helpful issue for those supporting their repatriation. So I think there's a long way to play it, and I think that's a good example, though, Barry, of there's a long way to play out on this, but. Is it going to get them to 76 seats? No.
Yeah, you have spoken in the time about you try and keep these issues, fairly narrowly based if you want to get them through. Angus Taylor is a leader who's defining himself. This is a very important time for him to define himself. There's a budget coming up. There are all sorts of other issues. And so I guess my question is, can this be seen as a bit of a distraction for him? I can see this shoring up support within his own ranks. I'm not sure there are too many other votes out there in the middle.
No. As I said, I don't think there's 76 seats on the table on this, but there's certainly, it's about building coalitions. That's something Labor's very good at, and I think this is part of that coalition. But the biggest challenge in being in opposition is to sort of pick your moments of when you switch from issues to issues, and how long you've milked an issue, I guess, for want of a better word, and then sort of switch onto another tack, because there comes a point of diminishing returns politically, where you've mopped up all the votes you're going to get on this, and meanwhile there's a whole bunch of votes that aren't animated by this issue, but are animated by the economy. And we know from all our polling that around 75% of the population are very animated about cost of living and housing.
Yeah, if we go beyond the politics of it now and just talk about the rights and wrongs of it, it just seems to me there are basic principles at work here, and that is that they are Australian citizens, and the government has an obligation to Australian citizens. They don't have to help them to come home, but they shouldn't be putting obstacles in their path either. So if they can make it home under their own steam, they're entitled to enter the country, and it's at that point where the authorities will decide whether charges need to be laid against anybody. But that way, the mothers come home with their children, and then the children get a chance to for the system to work for them.
Yeah. I think Chris Minns has been pretty forthright about that, to his absolute credit. But in another sort of chapter where this can sort of drag on, is that he has put down a few markers about the cost load of this. He said we would like some Commonwealth government support for that process. So it's just another side issue that I can see that this just keeps on running and running and running, and the media seems to have a big appetite for this story. So look, where this ends up, in terms of vote share and vote intention, is going to be really interesting this year.
Yeah, I know all sorts of stories are going to impact on people's attitudes, but the Guardian managed to speak with some kids in the camps, and there was one heartbreaking story of the young girl, 6 years old, never been outside of the camp, born there, and it is a hellhole, and she got out for 1 hour on that road to Damascus, and then they were turned around and went back, and they asked her what she'd seen, and she said she saw a drink shop and a small horse and a donkey.
Yeah,
that was her 1 hour out of that camp in 6 years. It's just shocking stuff. Look, we have an email on this from Lilia's Urban, and I think she asked some really interesting questions around this. She said that what she would like to know, the following: the families who have returned to Australia under both governments, what happened to them? Have they been a security risk? Have they been closely monitored? What have they been doing? Have they settled back into Australian life? Have the children integrated? What about their schooling, their behaviour and their general beliefs? And she said, surely all of this is important to the current discussion. I think she makes a really good point. Some research around that, I don't know whether the government would be helpful in terms of helping out the media on that, but the case studies, how's it gone so far? That is just so relevant, and it just brings so much context to this story if only it was available.
Yeah.
So I think she did really well on that email. I was pleased to receive it. All right, let's move on now to One Nation. And look, as I said before, there seem to be more pollsters these days than people being polled. I don't know whether there are more pollsters or they're just more regular, but there's such disparity between them as well. What is the picture in that area?
Well, Barry, as you know, I'm a liberal, which means I love competition, except when it applies to me. And so at Redbridge, we welcome competition. None of these firms are actually particularly new, but you're right, there's an absolute proliferation. It's easy content. But I think it's also a reflection, though, of, these are uncharted waters we're in right now. And not just the rise of One Nation, but the fragmentation of the major party vote. And so I think what we're seeing is a lot of corporate clients in regulatory space issues, like they just want to know what this all means. And, I did a podcast with Fran Kelly late last year where I fearlessly predicted 2026 would be a pollster's picnic, which I was half serious but half joking. But of course, it's actually been exactly that. So, I think everybody wants to know, is this Hanson thing real? Is it going to manifest itself on election night into votes? Is it going to keep on growing? What's the floor of their vote? And to be honest, we don't really know these questions yet. We're doing a lot of digging under the hood to try and understand what's driving these people towards One Nation. So far in our research, and we're going to have some really interesting data coming out soon, which I'd love to talk about when it's all completed. But what we're seeing is a lot of it is just a rejection of the two-party system. and some of them actually use those words, it's a little bit insiderish.
But one party more than another, to be fair.
No, it's actually, well, they're coming off the coalition pile, but they're starting to come off the Labor pile a little bit. I mean, overwhelmingly the coalition pile, as we know, because their vote is at 19%. But there's no sign that the One Nation vote is going down, even with Pauline Hanson's outrageous comments about Muslims in Australia. I feel in our research, respondents they've kind of priced it in, that she'll say those comments. And some of them just say, look, I don't agree with her on that, but, she's right on the rest, that sort of stuff. But there is a rejection of the two-party system. That is for some of them, probably a plurality, I think, that is at the heart of it. There's also a real sense that she's authentic. And, and we get this feedback in focus groups. They're like, even if you don't like her, you know where she stands. And voters are craving authenticity, and they don't necessarily see that from the major parties and leaders these days. So they're sort of two of the biggest drivers. Yeah. Yeah,
I accept that. And otherwise, you wouldn't have them polling in the high teens and early 20s in the opinion polls.
High 20s, high 20s federally, yeah.
High 20 in some places, yes. But that's when I talk about the disparity in the numbers. But I don't accept that it's on firm ground. I think it's a soft protest vote at this point, and we need to see it tested in a real election, and with South Australia coming up.
Yeah.
But it just seemed to me like in the United States, where you get 40% of those who voted are kind of rusted on Trump, no matter what he does, no matter his character failings or his misdemeanours, they're going to stick with him. That's not the situation, I don't think, here in Australia. And Pauline Hanson is not Donald Trump. She doesn't have the charisma and the presence of Donald Trump. I don't think she can expect the blind loyalty that Donald Trump has. So they could go either way when it comes to the poll itself. You mentioned before about they're taking votes mainly from the Liberal pile, but it's starting to happen with Labor. Anthony Green had some interesting statistics. He crunched the numbers this week, and he came up with the seats where the One Nation can expect to poll the strongest. This is federally now, not South Australia. He came up with 25 seats where the poll surge could put them into the three-party contest. 25 of them, 12 in Queensland, 6 in New South Wales. So that's really the battleground. Queensland, to a lesser extent, New South Wales. Then you've got 3 in Victoria, 2 in Western Australia, and 1 each in South Australia and Tasmania. But when you break that down, the parties are at risk in those 25 seats. 12 are Nationals. This is splitting the LNP into Nationals and Liberals. 12 are Nationals, 7 are Liberals, and 6 are Labor. But still, if the polls hold up, we might see a result like we've never seen before.
Yeah, I think I think you hit the nail on the head last week. You said, Xenophon's party, SA Best, in the 2018 election, about 6 months out, or even less than 6 months out, on Newspoll, they were 32% primary. They were leading. Labor and the Coalition were in the 20s. And then they kind of flamed out and they landed on 14%, but they didn't win a single seat. And Xenophon himself didn't even win the seat of Hartley. That was Vincent Tarzia, the previous state leader. So, and that is absolutely top of mind for me when discussing this issue, because there's 2 years to the federal election. As you say, there's state elections coming up this year in South Australia and Victoria, which will give us more insight. But, we're seeing in our research, it's more than just protest for a lot of these voters. Some is protest, there's no doubt, and they've kind of perhaps parked their vote there and they might flow back. However, a really significant proportion at that moment seems they want to empower her to shake the joint up. Yep,
they do. And maybe they just think they can do that through opinion polling, who knows.
Yeah.
But what happened with Nick Xenophon, of course, when it came to the crunch, it was mainly he had the grievances, but he didn't seem to have the solutions with his policies. And the other thing, of course, is candidates. And it's hard for somebody like Nick Xenophon or Pauline Hanson to get credible candidates when the focus comes on seat by seat. Let me just give you this example. This happened this week on candidates, One Nation candidates. A candidate in Queensland at the last election was convicted of electoral fraud, that he'd made false claims. A photograph emerged of another candidate wearing merchandise from a far-right extremist group. Another candidate, this was reported, repeatedly was breaching family violence orders. Another case, a man convicted, not accused, but convicted of rape and went to jail for it. He'll be playing a senior role in the campaign office. And a candidate in Hunter, one of the two seats where they polled well at the last election, posted footage of apparently two Muslim men walking onto a mining site in the Hunter Valley. And he said on his social media, they don't look like Muslims. And the question was raised as to whether they were searching for explosives. Now, that's racial profiling at its worst. All of that in a single week. Imagine the attention that will come on the candidates. And it's going to be a hell of a task anyway for them to find good, solid, credible candidates in all of those seats.
Yeah, because vetting candidates these days is incredibly difficult, even for the major parties and all the resources they have, because of social media, digital media, and so forth. Even if you allocate full-time staff to the operation, you still miss things. So, but will that matter? I guess, Barry. Will it matter to those people that just want to shake the joint up? Last week I spoke about some polling that we did where we said, which sentence best represents your view of the federal political system? Needs minor change, needs major change, doesn't need any change, burn it all down. Quite a lot of people have contacted me to sort of say, did you just shorthand that? Is that your explanation? And it's like, no, that was the exact words we used.
Oh, yeah.
And we use that because in focus groups, and this is where, polling, you do focus groups, you start hearing what we call creative leads or perceptions or responses, and starts being a little bit more than just a coincidence. You start hearing it almost every focus group. It might just be one person, but we did hear that kind of burn it all down, mate, burn it all down.
Oh, a lot of disaffected people out there.
And so that's why we tested it, and it was 15%.
Yeah.
So, and that's, I suspect, One Nation's flaw, even with the worst candidates in the world, and I think they just want a vehicle to exercise their frustration. And I thought it was really interesting. Albanese was asked to play a word game. He did a Herald Sun Future Victoria event with the Premier and other luminaries, and he was asked a one-word association of various people and personnel, and he was asked about One Nation voters, and he said frustrated. Now, that's similar to what we're seeing. That's obviously coming from Labor research. He's obviously very keen not to call them deplorables like Hillary Clinton. He wants those small number of Labor voters who've gone onto the One Nation pile, he wants them to come back home.
He got the One Nation response right when he said frustrated. When he was asked about Grace Tame, he said difficult. Not something you should say about a strong woman Prime Minister. He got that wrong, but then he said what he meant was she'd had a difficult life. Just before we leave this topic, I want to mention, I got a note from an old colleague of mine, Dennis Atkins, who worked for the Courier Mail, right? And he's this is in relation to the South Australian election. He's lived in South Australia, in Queensland and in Canberra, so he's got a good sense of this. I've always valued his judgment. He talks about the 7 or 8 non-metropolitan seats that One Nation will challenge strongly in South Australia. Half of them, he said, will be Labor and One Nation competing for first, and the other half will be the Liberals and One Nation competing for first. That's his judgment on it. So the Liberals' decision to allocate preferences to One Nation becomes absolutely crucial. If the Liberals finish third, then preferences in many cases will elect One Nation. And he points out the last time the Liberals gave preferences to One Nation, Queensland, 1988, when they got 11 seats. Yeah. Just an interesting side with that election.
Smart man, Dennis.
Really closing in on us.
Yeah.
Okay, now on the Liberal Party, and I want to talk about just developments, what's going on there through the lens of Keith Wallison. In other words, through the lens of a defeated candidate and somebody who didn't deserve to lose. He just on background, he held the seat of Menzies, which the Liberal Party should still be holding, of course, if things were going well. In many respects, he's the future of the party. He's in his mid to late 40s, a member of the Victorian Bar, an Afghanistan veteran, and he lost because of the mistakes of the party. Now, he wrote this article where he talked about the party of the forgotten people, the Liberal Party. The party of the forgotten people has itself been forgotten in the suburbs, and he said that Chris Pine's observation when he said the Liberals were an election-winning machine no longer holds true. I'm not even sure it did at the time, because he kind of said it with a smile on his face. But anyway,
Christopher's always been prone to a little,
a little hyperbole. Yeah. He said, look, what he said is that you can't write off major political parties, but much of what goes on can be cyclical. But he raised the question, what if this time it's not? What struck you about that article?
Yeah, Keith is one of the really deep thinkers in the Liberal Party, and his loss and James Stephens' loss in Sturt, Christopher Pyne's old seat, were two of the biggest body blows in the last election. Keith is a person that I think a lot of Labor people respect as well, because he's got strong views, but he argues them incredibly well, even if you don't agree. He's not a talking points guy, and he just doesn't assert things, and it's not just a knee-jerk reaction. For example, he's very much a conservative in his outlook, and certainly a constitutional conservative. He argued very vocally against the voice, but on constitutional grounds. Being a barrister, he had a strong background in the law and what he felt was important foundationally. But Keith, I think, has written a really brilliant piece. The Fin Review did a smaller cut-down version, but I'd recommend all listeners take a read of it, because Keith, I think, has diagnosed the problem better than anyone else in the Liberal Party. And I always say in politics, if you can diagnose the problem, you've basically got the solution worked out. And I think at the moment, there's too many people in the Liberal Party who aren't diagnosing the problem. They're looking for shortcuts. Oh, we'll take this position on immigration and we'll win. No, it's not as easy as that. It's actually a lot more complicated than that. As we've said, there's net votes on the table, but there's not 76 seats on the table on that issue alone. So Keith has really looked into those urban seats and, the suburbs, families and suburbs.
Yeah, and on immigration, one thing he reminded Liberal Party supporters about is that migrant families, there are migrant families out there who now don't believe the Liberal Party fights for them. But he gave this...
Keith himself was born overseas, by the way.
Right.
Yeah.
Where was he born?
Dublin.
Dublin, right. Well, he gave this example. He went back to the Howard years more than 20 years ago and credited Mark Textor with the Phil and Jenny advertisements at the time, crafted by Mark Textor. But Phil and Jenny were this kind of and he said this is the equivalent of Phil and Jenny these days. She's 32, she's a woman, university educated, she rents in suburban Melbourne. Her parents own a small business. They migrated from China 30 years ago. He said, this is modern Australia, and these are my words, not him, but that profile does sit in the centre of Australian society now. That's the kind of message that he's trying to get out there.
Yeah. And I would say, though, that Phil and Jenny narrative that Tex did, which served so well, albeit in 1996, 30 years ago now, I think Australia is now such a different country that you actually need multiple narratives. You need sort of VJ and Sally. You need Robert and Tom. You need a whole bunch of different narratives out there, because sort of picking a median voter, which used to be straight from the playbook for both major parties, is no longer going to get you where you need to get, I think.
Yeah, he did talk about, apart from the migrant thing, millennials are alienated, and but they feel they're being locked out of home ownership. And I like the point he made around this. He said your partner in business, Cos Samaras, has been going on about this for years, and he said that there are voices outside the party who see it clearly. Interesting observation to make, because when you're in the position that they're in, you'd think you'd take advice wherever it came from, but there's a real resentment if it's somebody outside of the party. The attitude is, we'll take care of our own business. We don't need your support. But it was interesting that he credited Cos with that.
Yeah, and again, it just shows that Keith is a thinker, and he reads all different viewpoints, which I think is really important. A bit of a lost art from both major sides actually these days. I think how the other side thinks and operates, but also how they're coming at different issues is a real lost art. And it speaks to Keith is always thinking about, how do we build the Liberal Party tent? How do we make it a bigger tent? And that means not putting litmus tests on what it means to be a real Liberal. And I think that's become a real habit in the last 10 years in particular, of sort of, well, if you support the voice, you're not a real Liberal. And the truth of it is there are some great Liberals, including Mark Textor himself, who has helped engineer so many Liberal victories over the years, who was not just a vocal supporter of the voice, but he was actually actively working on the campaign. Now, to sort of say that dismissed text is not a real Liberal is actually offensive, but it's actually stupid. And I think, Keith recognises that, but I don't think the party leadership as a rule of thumb quite appreciates that particular point.
Okay, before we get onto the policies facing the government, there's Will from California emailed, and he's following up on my rant last week in defence of the preferential voting system. And he says that this misinformation about first past the post will be part of a coordinated campaign. He pointed to the Pauline Hanson-Barnaby Joyce interview with Karl Stefanovic when they said, like a broken record, only 34% of Australians voted for this government, right? When all that matters in our system is that 55% of Australians preferred Labor as a government over the coalition on offer. An important point, and he said this is his message from California, that he's seen some rhetoric on abortion, mass immigration, which he says strongly aligns with Republicans, and he expects some coordination between the two. But if we saw in the last election, it's not a particularly wise thing to do, to too closely align yourself with what are seen as Trump policies.
Yeah, I think also you got to pick your fights, and this is not a fight that the centre-right can win. It's arguable if it's going to really advantage them anyway, because it'll be a totally different system to campaign in, and Paul Erickson will just adjust his campaign accordingly. But, there's no votes in this issue, and all you're doing is you're taking up bandwidth when you're trying to communicate messages, where the most important issue in town is the issue we're about to discuss next.
Yep, the economy. And this week, underlying inflation went to 3.4% in a year to January from 3.3% the month before. And then all of a sudden there were forecasts of the possibility or probability of an interest rate rise by May to be 95%.
Yep, and there's the market is also talking about the possibility of a second interest rate rise this year. It's less orthodox and less popular, but there is even some commentators saying maybe just a 50-point basis rise in May, and that'll be it for the year. But so effectively 2 interest rate rises in one go, just to really tap the brakes. But this is the number one issue in town, and for all the problems that the Liberal Party has got, all the problems that Keith Wallahan identified, Jim Chalmers and Anthony Albanese have got a massive problem with this economy, and there's more and more voices out there calling on to slow down government spending. Barry, there's an old rule that it's not voters that cause inflation, it's governments that spend too much. It's not voters that spend too much. And I think, I thought it was interesting the other week, Phil Lowe came out, who most Australians wouldn't know, and those Australians that would remember who he is would probably mostly remember him for the fact that he was the head of the RBA in 2020 that said interest rates will not go up until 2024. That's when they took them down to record lows, almost nothing.
Remember that well.
And then, of course...
So there were a lot of people who suffered 12 interest rate rises in a row. Yeah,
they went up in 2022 just after Scott Morrison called the election. So it's really something that could have just let go through to the keeper. But I thought it was really interesting that Jim Chalmers and Albanese monstered Phil Lowe, really went after him hard and criticised his comments. It showed that maybe there's a lot of sensitivity there. And I think Labor are very good at understanding their weaknesses. In fact, I think they know their weaknesses better than the coalition know their weaknesses. Which
just
is one of the reasons
put some of that into context, so the kind of knee-jerk reaction to the interest rate, to the inflation rate rise, was tempered a bit when Michelle Bullock stepped up at a speech after these predictions were made. And she said the RBA will take its time determining its next move. I think we have to be patient. But then this, I think, was the most important thing. She said, inflation is a bit elevated. We don't think it's taking off again, but it's a bit elevated. So I'm not assuming at this stage that there'll be an increase in May, though you'd think it's more likely than not.
Yeah. Well, I think the real test will be the federal budget coming up. Jim Chalmers delivered a brilliant political document last time in the lead up to the election, as you'd expect your Treasurer to do. But now he has to deliver an economic document. And that's going to have to include spending. There's just no way around it. And I know that that's going to upset people, it's going to upset voters, and it's going to fracture some of those coalitions. But there really is no alternative for the Labor government.
You know, the one thing that they're saying, somebody was quoted, I think a minister but not identified, but it was an interesting quote that the word is getting around or being put around the ministry. Forget about the nice to have things in this budget. The nice to have things. It's interesting. Like, okay, you can kind of accept that. You can't have it. It'd be nice to have it, but you can't have it. You can't afford it. That takes you to the capital gains tax concession, right? It just seems to me where young people, particularly young people, are struggling, and yet we still justify concessions to people who not only own a house or homes, but they then go and invest in more homes, and we give, as a government, we encourage them to invest, so the taxpayer covers the incentive to invest. That, to me, goes right in that bracket. Nice to have, but is it really necessary?
Yeah, and I think the opposition's response to this will be very interesting. Angus Taylor gave an interview where he said, "My starting point is I oppose it," which I thought was clever language, because you want to leave that sort of trap door or that exit route, an off-ramp. You don't want to lock yourself in where, you're seen to be, you'll be positioned as protecting, multiple asset class voters. However, the coalition does need to regain the kind of lower taxing mandate, which, they lost hugely in the last election. Jim Chalmers won that comfortably. So they've got to make a few decisions. I mean, I guess their two strategic options are to completely oppose it to the bitter end. And bear in mind, their position is irrelevant in legislative terms because the House of Representatives and in the Senate, the Greens will almost certainly support changes to the CGT. However, it's what message does it send to the electorate. So they've got a choice. They can either oppose it and try and say, well, we're the party of lower taxes, but then I think you're in a real danger of Labor using all their microphones and sort of say, well, hang on, you're protecting multiple asset classes and all the lines that you just mentioned before, Barry. So I think probably the second strategic option they can look at, which I think I would favour, is you say, yes, we'll support this, because it doesn't matter if you do or not, on the proviso that it goes into income tax cuts, because we want Gen Z and millennials who are working hard, creating careers, working their way up through the ladder and their pay scales. We want them to keep more of their income so they can actually invest in assets like a house. And then that will put pressure on Labor. And I think that would be a good sort of strategic option for the coalition to try and talk about income tax cuts, appear to be sort of the party of lower taxes again, and start building a bit of a narrative.
Yeah, Keith Walhan, we mentioned before, argued in that column for getting rid of the negative gearing, have it on the first house but not on the second and third and so on. And the head of the Commonwealth Bank on 7:30 came out in support of chipping away at the concessions on the capital gains tax. So things might be changing. Now the government is saying, okay, you can't have the nice to have things because they cost money. It's time to start looking at getting rid of some of the money they're now spending.
But the test for Labor will be on this.
You don't need money for that, though. The point I want to make is what you need is political capital to do that kind of thing, and they've got it, lots of it.
But I think to remove those concessions is fine. But if they then basically take that money and keep on spending, they're going to create, put more fuel on the inflation fire. So I think, if they're smart, they'll sort of beat Labor, beat the coalition to the punch and say, we're going to put it into income tax, and sort of do it down scale so, lower income earners can keep more.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's it for this week. This podcast was made on the lands of the Wurundjeri people and the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. It was produced by Camilla Hannon, who, by the way, is leaving us today to pursue, no doubt, a more exciting life. Thank you, Camilla. You've been with us from the beginning. You've successfully bedded us down and got us into a rhythm, and we really do appreciate your support along the way. Video production, Burton Wynne and Sanjana Jose.
The executive producer is Hannah Parks.
I'm Barrie Cassidy.
And I'm Tony Barry, and this is Back to Back Barries, Guardian Australia podcast.